They say Montana keeps its secrets buried deep in the snow end. In 1978, one of those secrets vanished without a trace. A young wildlife photographer, Claire Denor, set out to capture the untouched wilderness of the Bitterroot Valley. She never came back. No body, no witnesses, just a camera, a torn map, and a trail that ended where silence began. For decades, the town whispered theories: a bear attack, a runaway, a lover's betrayal. But 36 years later, a shocking discovery thawed the frozen truth. What investigators found would shake the very foundation of this quiet mountain community. This isn't just another cold case. It's a story about obsession, guilt, and the one photograph that refused to stay buried. Join us as we uncover how one woman's disappearance became the key to unraveling a darkness Montana hoped to forget. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The Bitterroot Valley in Montana wasn't just a place on the map. It was a living, breathing wilderness, stretching as far as the eye could see, where the mountains rose like silent sentinels and the rivers carved secrets into the land. In the fall of 1978, the valley wore a cloak of gold and crimson. Leaves fluttered like whispers of things left unsaid. The air carried a sharp, clean bite, and for anyone who had never ventured into these rugged terrains, it was easy to underestimate the raw power of the wilderness. But for Claire Danner, it was a canvas. It was her obsession. Claire was 24, a wildlife photographer with an eye for moments that most people would never notice. She had spent years studying her craft, roaming forests, observing the delicate balance of predator and prey. The light that struck a fox's safour, just so the mist that rolled over a morning meadow. Her friends described her as fearless, yet meticulous, a perfectionist, some would say, driven by a need to capture life before it vanished. That drive is what brought her to Bitterroot in October 1978, armed with nothing more than a leather camera strap, her notebook, and a worn-out backpack containing the bare essentials. She arrived at the edge of Lost Trail Pass on a Sunday morning, the sky a muted gray. The mountains loomed ahead like silent judges. Locals who saw her remembered that day clearly. The way she waved politely at the gas station clerk, the slight frown she wore while checking the map, and the way her camera seemed almost like an extension of her hand. There was an air of determination around her. She wasn't just going hiking. She was entering a world that had never truly belonged to humans. Her plan was simple: traverse a series of remote trails, document the valley's wildlife, and return before nightfall. But as any seasoned tracker will tell you, simplicity in the wilderness is often a fragile illusion. The trails in Bitterroot were unforgiving. Fallen logs, sudden cliffs, and hidden streams created hazards that could turn even a short trek into a perilous journey. Claire was prepared. She carried a compass, a small first aid kit, and a field guide. But she was aware that even the best preparation couldn't account for every variable. That morning, the mountains seemed calm, but there was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the silence before a storm. By noon, Claire had reached a narrow ravine, one she had marked carefully on her map. This area, locals would later say, was treacherous, known for sudden rock slides and hidden sinkholes. Claire moved carefully, snapping photographs of a rare pair of bald eagles perched on a cliff edge. The shutter clicks were faint, yet in retrospect, those images were the last evidence of her alive. She paused to adjust the lens and glanced down at the valley below. It stretched endlessly, a mix of green and ochre, with streams glinting like veins of silver in the fading light. She jotted a quick note: eagles spotted. Valley below looks untouched. Will descend slowly. Keep alert. She wasn't aware that someone had noticed her arrival. A local forest ranger, Thomas Halley, had been on patrol that morning. Halley was in his late 30s, a veteran of the Montana wilderness, known for his strict routines and quiet demeanor. He had been keeping tabs on the remote trails, ensuring no one trespassed in areas marked off limits due to wildlife conservation efforts. When Halley saw Claire with her camera, he approached with curiosity. Their interaction was brief, almost mundane, a casual greeting, a reminder about staying on the main path. But later, as Halley returned to his ranger station, he noted her presence in his log. Young woman entering Lost Trail Pass alone. Camera Into. No apparent experience with backcountry navigation. Meanwhile, Claire continued, unaware of the subtle shifts around her. The sun began to dip behind the western ridges, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Birds had begun their evening calls, and the rustle of small mammals echoed through the underbrush. She paused to photograph a fox darting across a clearing, the moment fleeting, magical, captured only in the frame of her camera. She wrote in her notebook, "Fox startled. Perfect. Shot. Need batiens. Patience is everything." What no one could predict was how quickly things would change. A sudden drop in temperature, combined with an unexpected shift in the weather, created a thin fog that clung to the ground. Visibility dropped, and familiar trails became confusing mazes. Claire checked her compass, but the dense canopy made it hard to read the sun. She noted the time, 3:47 p.m., a precise entry she would later make in her recovered notebook. The mountains that had seemed majestic and serene now felt imposing, almost suffocating. At some point during her descent, she passed a small clearing. Her camera captured something unusual, a set of footprints leading off the trail into a dense copse of pines. They weren't hers. They weren't hers. They were fresh, and they vanished just as suddenly into the undergrowth. Claire paused, instinctively noting the anomaly in her notebook. She always trusted her instincts, yet there was a tension she couldn't shake. She decided to follow them briefly, curious if they led to an animal or another human presence. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she moved. By 4:30 p.m., Claire was out of sight from any other hiker or ranger patrol. She sent a quick message to a friend via a shortwave radio she always carried. "Lost trail pass. Going deeper. Back before sunset." That would be the last time anyone ever heard from her. Later that evening, when Claire failed to return, her absence was first noted by a local innkeeper who had seen her enter Bitterroot the previous night. Initial searches were small-scale, local volunteers combing through trails with flashlights, calling her name into the chill night air. The mountains responded with silence, their secrets unbroken. Within hours, the search expanded. Law enforcement, forest rangers, and volunteers formed a perimeter that stretched 4 miles. Helicopters combed the skies, beams cutting through the dense canopy. But there was no trace, no gear, no footprints beyond those she had unknowingly left. No sign of struggle. Her family, devastated, reported her missing the following morning. Claire's father, a retired Marine, insisted on helping in the search, while her mother, a former nurse, worried over every possibility, imagining scenarios both tragic and unimaginable. News spread quickly. Bitterroot Valley, usually quiet and unassuming, became a hub of anxious murmurs and worried faces. Posters were printed, bulletins issued, but still, the forest kept her secret. What made Claire's disappearance particularly haunting was the precision of her planning. She was experienced, cautious, and respectful of the wilderness. Anyone could have assumed she simply got lost, but those who knew her understood that the odds of accidental disappearance were slim. Something or someone had intervened. Within the first week, investigators began documenting clues that, at the time, seemed minor, but would later become pivotal. The torn map recovered near the trailhead showed that someone had folded it deliberately, not haphazardly. Her camera was missing, but her backpack was found abandoned, seemingly untouched, and most chilling, the footprints she had noted in her journal, the ones she had briefly followed, were still visible in the mud near the clearing, but they led nowhere. For decades, the question lingered: who or what had taken Claire Daner from the Bitterroot Valley that October day? Was it a predator, natural or human? A moment of misjudgment, or a carefully orchestrated act of malice? The stage was set for an investigation that would span 36 years. A case that would later shock an entire community, uncover secrets long buried, and reveal truths hidden in plain sight. But for now, all anyone had were the last entries in a notebook, a handful of photographs, and the chilling emptiness of a valley that had swallowed one of its own. As the wind whispered through the pines and the evening shadows deepened, one thing was certain: the mountains were keeping their secret, and the story of Claire Dana was only just beginning. Bitterroot Valley wasn't large, but it had a rhythm all its own, the kind of rhythm that outsiders never noticed until it stopped entirely. In 1978, the town was quiet, almost quaint. Its streets were lined with small wooden storefronts, diners that smelled of bacon and fresh coffee, and schools that rang their final bells with the punctuality of clockwork. Residents knew each other, shared the kind of trust that only comes from generations living in proximity, and counted on the surrounding wilderness as both a friend and a silent warning. People respected the land. They fear Italiano. When Claire Dana disappeared, that rhythm shattered. The first to notice were locals who ran small businesses along Main Street in Hamilton and Stevensville, gas station attendants, shopkeepers, even the postman all recalled seeing Claire's bright red jacket walking into town just days before her planned expedition. She had an energy about her, a purposeful stride, the type of confidence that drew attention, even without trying. But when she didn't return, the same observers watched as a cloud of worry settled over the community. Their casual chatter became hushed conversations, filled with fear and uncertainty. Within hours of a disappearance, the sheriff's office of Ravalli County initiated a search. Sheriff Harold Green was a man of practical wisdom, the kind who had spent decades patrolling the winding roads and hidden trails of Montana. He understood the land, and he understood people. "The mountains don't give up their secrets, Cicely," he told his deputies, voice calm but tinged with gravity. "If someone is missing, we have to think beyond the obvious." Green had handled missing person cases before, but none quite like this. Claire's disappearance carried a weight. She was careful, prepared, and highly experienced. No ordinary misadventure explained her absence. The community mobilized quickly. Volunteers formed search parties, scouring trails with flashlights and calling her name. Fishermen combed the rivers. Farmers guided deputies through fields and forests. Even local hunters put aside their autumn routines, joining in the search with the same quiet determination that had defined their lives in the valley. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued. Every sound in the woods, a snap of a twig, the call of a distant owl was scrutinized. And yet, the wilderness offered nothing. No trace. No int. No int. Just silence, growing heavier with every passing hour. Rumors began circulating almost immediately. In small towns, information travels faster than official reports. Some suggested a bear attack. Others whispered about a lover's quarrel or a jealous colleague. A few even murmured darker theories, that someone from outside the valley had taken her. Each theory was dissected and debated, but no one had proof. Sheriff Green cautioned patience. Speculation won't bring her home, he reminded the town. Yet the fear remained. Meanwhile, the local newspapers published front-page stories. Photographs of Claire smiling, camera in hand, were distributed widely. Families in neighboring towns were warned, and law enforcement agencies in the surrounding counties were alerted. In the newsroom of the Bitterroot Valley Gazette, reporters worked late into the night, piecing together interviews, cross-checking sightings, and chasing leads. Every journalist seemed to sense that this wasn't a typical missing person case. There was something more, something lingering beneath the surface, and their instinct was correct. At the Daner household, the absence was a palpable ache. Claire's parents, Walter and Ellen, were devastated, their lives suddenly defined by uncertainty. Walter spent long hours reviewing maps and trail guides, retracing Claire's steps with a quiet obsession. Ellen maintained a detailed log of calls, sightings, and search party updates. Friends and relatives came and went, offering comfort, but the unanswered question remained. What had happened to Claire? The uncertainty gnawed at them daily, an invisible force that seemed to shadow the valley itself. Locals who had ventured near Lostro Pass reported unsettling details. Footprints appeared and disappeared mysteriously. Some hikers claimed to see flashes of red, a jacket or scarf, in areas where Claire could not have returned. These reports, though unverified, added to the tension. Fear began to seep into everyday life. Children were warned not to wander too far into the woods, and even experienced hunters took extra precautions. The valley, once familiar and safe, had become a place of suspicion. Every rustle in the leaves, every animal's cry, was scrutinized as a potential clue or threat. Sheriff Green and his deputies began investigating anyone who might have had contact with Claire. They questioned hikers, local guides, and even nearby ranchers. One neighbor, an elderly man named Carl Peterson, recalled seeing a truck parked near the trailhead the morning Claire disappeared. Another mentioned a figure moving quietly along the ridge, someone who didn't belong. Every account was logged, cataloged, and analyzed, but the pieces didn't fit together. For the first time, the valley realized that Claire's disappearance wasn't just an accident of nature. It hinted at human intent. The FBI was called in within the first week. Agent Martha Klein, known for her meticulous approach to cold cases, arrived in Bitterroot with a small team. They examined the terrain, documented the search operations, and reviewed reports from the sheriff's office. Klein noted the patterns in Claire's movements, the timing of her expedition, and the potential risks in the wilderness. Her team treated every clue as critical. A broken branch, a partial footprint, even the notes in Claire's field journal. Every element could be a thread that unraveled the mystery. And Klein knew the longer a case remained unsolved, the colder the trail would become. Despite their best efforts, days turned into weeks with no breakthrough. Fear hardened into a collective anxiety. Town meetings were held to coordinate search efforts and review the investigation. Volunteers became restless. Law enforcement pressured, and whispers of foul play grew louder. Yet, even in this fog of uncertainty, one thing was clear: Clyde Danares' disappearance had revealed cracks in the valley Sereni Fasaji. The wilderness, long considered a silent protector, now felt like a conspirator, hiding secrets just beyond reach. By the end of October, Bitterroot Valley had changed. The rhythm that once defined the town, the steady beat of daily life, was fractured. Windows were shuttered earlier, evening walks became rare, and even the most skeptical townsfolk acknowledged the presence of something unexplainable. The mountains remained unchanged, indifferent to human fear, but the people below felt the weight of their shadow. Claire's absence was more than a missing person report. It was a lingering question, a wound in the heart of a community that prided itself on knowing its neighbors and its land. And yet, within that fear, the groundwork for discovery had already begun. Every observation, every reported sighting, every whispered theory would later become crucial evidence. The town's anxiety was not just panic, it was attention, a lens focusing on details that would eventually pierce decades of silence. Claire Danner had entered the wilderness as an observer, a witness to nature's raw beauty. Now, in her absence, the valley itself became a witness, holding its secrets tightly, challenging investigators to see beyond what was visible, to question what was assumed, and to uncover truths that had been hiding in plain sight. The morning Claire Danner vanished, the Bitterroot Valley seemed deceptively ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the golden canopy, highlighting the winding trails with soft, amber light. Birds called to each other from the high branches, and the scent of damp earth and pine filled the crisp autumn air. To anyone passing through, it looked like just another peaceful day in Montana. But beneath that calm, the valley held tension, the kind that creeps into the edges of your vision and lingers in the corners of your mind. Claire's path that day would transform this tranquil wilderness into the center of one of the state's most haunting mysteries. Claire's plan had been meticulous. She had mapped the trails the night before, noting vantage points, potential hazards, and locations for photographing wildlife. Her notebook contained careful sketches, a record of previous expeditions, and reminders to stay alert. Each step she took into the forest reflected a deliberate understanding of her environment. She was not reckless. She was prepared, and yet, the events that unfolded that morning would defy every precaution she had taken. As she descended the lost trail pass, Claire recorded the details in her journal. Sunlight slants through the pines. Morning dew glistens. Tracks of a deer. Follow the brook. Keep moving, slowly. Patience. Her handwriting was neat, precise, reflection of her methodical mind. She paused occasionally to adjust her camera lens, capturing images of a herd of elk grazing near a clearing. Those photographs, later recovered, would become some of the last tangible evidence of her presence alive. It was around mid-morning that Claire first noticed something unusual. Along the side of the trail, partially obscured by fallen leaves, were footprints that didn't belong to her. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft soil, suggesting someone had passed that way only minutes earlier. Instinctively, she stopped and observed the path. Her notebook entry read, "Tracks near Cree. Not mini. Small, possibly human. Far too risky." She chose to proceed cautiously, aware that the forest, as beautiful as it was, could be unpredictable. Claire's decision to continue along the trail would prove fateful. The path narrowed as it wound through dense undergrowth, forcing her to move carefully. Her camera clicked quietly with each shot, documenting deer tracks, wildflowers, and distant glimpses of mountain peaks. In the distance, a trickling stream reflected the sunlight, a serene contrast to the growing tension in the forest. The footprints she had seen earlier seemed to vanish without explanation, as if the person who left them had melted into the wilderness. Around noon, Claire reached a small clearing. Here, the trail split, and she paused to decide which direction to take. The map in her backpack showed a shorter route, leading up a ridge, closer to the cliffs, while the longer path wound along the stream. Claire made the choice to ascend the ridge, believing it offered a better vantage point for photographs. She jotted a note in her journal. Ridge seems promising. Light will change soon. Need steady hands. That entry would later become one of the last confirmed records of her movements. What no one knew at the time was that someone had been watching. A figure, careful and deliberate, had followed Claire from the trailhead. That person knew the terrain intimately, understanding the paths that provided cover. The places where visibility was limited, and the areas where a single misstep could leave a hiker vulnerable. Observers in small towns later recalled seeing a suspicious vehicle parked near the trailhead early that morning. A dark truck, its engine off, seemingly abandoned. But by the time law enforcement investigated, the truck had vanished, leaving only a faint imprint of tires in the dirt. As Claire moved higher along the ridge, the air grew colder, carrying a crisp bite that signaled the approaching evening. She paused to photograph a lone mountain goat perched on a rocky ledge. It was a perfect shot, the kind that would make any wildlife photographer's heart race with excitement. She wrote in her notebook, "Goat on ledge, composition perfect. Sunlight striking horns. Must return tomorrow for better angles." She had no way of knowing that this would be the last entry she ever wrote voluntarily. By mid-afternoon, the ridge narrowed to a precarious trail hugging a cliffside. Claire's steps became more cautious. The camera clicked less frequently, replaced by her focus on each footfall, each rock, each tree root. Somewhere behind her, the quiet snap of a twig went unnoticed, the first sign that she was no longer alone in the forest. Later investigations revealed that a second set of footprints had appeared along the ridge that day, following hers almost exactly, but with a calculated distance. Whoever was behind her had planned it meticulously, remaining unseen while guiding the encounter toward a dark conclusion. At 3:47 p.m., according to the recovered journal, Claire paused again. The ridge opened onto a narrow clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. She took a photograph, carefully adjusting the camera lens, unaware that this view would become emblematic of her disappearance. A silent, haunting reminder of what had been lost. It was here that the unthinkable occurred. The forest, which had seemed so alive and inviting, became a stage for a vanishing act that would confound investigators for decades. By late afternoon, Claire did not return to the trailhead. Absence was noted first by a passing hiker who had seen her earlier that morning. When he arrived at the ranger station to report her missing, panic began to ripple through the community. Sheriff Harold Green immediately dispatched search teams, and forest rangers began combing the trails systematically. They called out her name, their voices swallowed by the vastness of the valley. Dogs were brought in to track her scent, but even trained canine units struggled to find a trail that hadn't been deliberately obscured. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The once golden leaves became shadows. The streams that had glittered in the morning now reflected the dim light of a setting sun. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, seemed amplified, feeding the fear of those searching. It was as though the wilderness itself conspired to keep Claire's secret. Search teams returned to base camp exhausted, frustrated by the lack of progress. Maps were reviewed, logs rechecked, and theories debated late into the night. Yet, the forest remained indifferent. The next day, the search expanded. Helicopters combed the valley from above, spotlight beams cutting through mist and tree cover. Volunteers descended into ravines, calling her name, scanning every possible hiding place. Investigators interviewed hikers, loggers, and anyone who might have seen her. Each lead was scrutinized, documented, and still, the puzzle pieces didn't fit together. Claire's careful preparation and experience seemed to clash with the reality of her disappearance. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. What made this case more confounding was the lack of evidence. Her backpack was found near the trailhead, untouched except for a small tear in the side pocket. Her camera was missing, The journal contained the last recorded entries but offered no hint of danger or panic. And the footprints. They led to the clearing on the ridge but then ended abruptly, as though she had been lifted from the earth. Investigators cataloged everything meticulously, knowing that even the smallest detail could one day become a crucial clue. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the valley was enveloped in darkness, the fear within Bitterroot Valley intensified. Families stayed indoors. Whispers of foul play replaced the usual town chatter, and the mountains stood silent, concealing their secret. Cadaver's disappearance had turned an ordinary autumn day into the beginning of a decades-long investigation, one that would challenge the expertise of law enforcement, the persistence of volunteers, and the resilience of her family. In the weeks that followed, the initial shock would evolve into a structured investigation. Agents would take photographs, map every trail, and reconstruct her last known movements. Forensic teams would later examine footprints, soil samples, and vegetation patterns. Witnesses would recount fleeting sightings, some credible, some not. Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, was part of a larger story, a story of precision, planning, and the unforgiving wilderness that had swallowed Claire Donner without a trace. Thomas Halley had spent most of his adult life in the Bitterroot Valley. A man in his late 30s, he was known as the kind of forest ranger who could read the wilderness like a book. Every tree, every stream, every hidden trail was etched into his memory. Locals trusted him, or at least respected him, because Halley had earned his authority through years of navigating the valley's dangers and preserving its fragile beauty. But when Claire Donner disappeared, Halley became more than just a caretaker of the forest. He became a figure of scrutiny, a person of interest, and a man whose secrets would later unfold in ways no one could have predicted. Halley had been on patrol the morning Claire entered Lost Trail Pass. His logs, meticulous and precise, showed the paths he monitored daily, the conditions of the trails, and any unusual occurrences. On the day of her disappearance, his notes mentioned a young woman in a bright red jacket, moving purposefully along the main trail with a camera. Unaccompanied, her peers experienced no apparent distress, he wrote. The entry was mundane, almost casual, the kind of observation a ranger made hundreds of times. Yet, decades later, those lines would be scrutinized as investigators sought to reconstruct the timeline of Claire's last known movements. Halley was described by colleagues as calm, disciplined, and methodical. He had a reputation for being able to remain collected in emergencies, a trait that earned him respect in both professional and civilian circles. But beneath the composed exterior, there was an intensity that few understood. He had grown up roaming these forests, learning to track animals, read weather patterns, and anticipate danger. That knowledge, while vital for his role, also made him a man capable of extraordinary foresight, and, some would later argue, extraordinary deception. After Claire's disappearance, Halley participated in the initial search. He led teams into treacherous areas, combing ridges, ravines, and valleys that few outsiders dared to enter. His familiarity with the terrain allowed search parties to cover more ground efficiently. Halley organized volunteers, coordinated helicopter sweeps, and provided insights into likely areas where someone could be lost or trapped. On the surface, he appeared to be a pillar of leadership, guiding the town's desperate efforts with competence and dedication. However, subtle details raised questions. Certain areas of the trail seemed untouched despite thorough searches. Footprints that had been noted in Claire's journal disappeared abruptly, with no explanation of how they could vanish in soil and leaf litter that normally retained impressions. Minor discrepancies in Hale's logs, times slightly off. Observations that seemed unnecessary would later form the foundation for suspicion. At the time, no one thought much of these details. They were dismissed as human error, the natural inconsistencies of a man with decades of responsibility in rugged wilderness. Beyond the professional, Halley had personal dimensions that few outside his family and close colleagues knew. He had lost a sister in a hiking accident years earlier, an event that left him with a profound respect for the fragility of life in the mountains. That experience gave him empathy for those lost in the wild, but it also cultivated a hypervigilance bordering on obsession. Friends later described him as withdrawn, sometimes brooding, but always methodical. A man whose mind never fully rested, always scanning, calculating, predicting. That combination of skill, experience, and intensity would later complicate how investigators interpreted his actions on the day Claire disappeared. As weeks passed and the search turned into a full-scale investigation, Halley cooperated with law enforcement. He provided detailed explanations of trails, weather conditions, and possible animal activity. Investigators relied heavily on his knowledge, trusting that his decades in the field gave him insights they could not replicate. Yet, some small inconsistencies began to emerge. Minor contradictions in his statements, subtle variations in recollection of times and locations, planted the seeds of doubt. These were not blatant errors, but when combined with the lack of evidence, they raised questions that would linger for decades. Outside the investigation, Hale's life continued under the public eye. Neighbors saw him patrolling the trails, always attentive, always vigilant. Children waved as he passed in his Green Ranger uniform. Hikers and photographers, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded, admired his knowledge and guidance. To the world, he remained the dedicated ranger, a guardian of the Bitterroot Valley. To investigators, however, the complexity of his knowledge, his routines, and his intimate familiarity with the wilderness introduced a layer of intrigue. Was it possible that someone so close to the terrain could have orchestrated the perfect disappearance? As the search for Claire continued, Hale's position became paradoxical. He was indispensable, the very expertise the town relied on for hope. But that same expertise created opportunities for concealment, manipulation, and misdirection. Investigators would later recognize this duality as a critical factor in understanding how the case remained unresolved for so long. Every observation he made, every decision about search paths, and every detail he logged had to be revisited with new eyes. Decades later, when forensic science finally caught up to the complexities of the case. Yet, for Hale himself, there was no outward indication of guilt or malice at the time. He attended briefings, answered questions, and coordinated with search teams. His demeanor remained composed. He even offered suggestions for improving search coverage and revisiting areas that volunteers had deemed unproductive. To anyone observing, he was simply fulfilling his duty. But those who would later examine the case realized that his combination of skill, opportunity, and access had created a scenario where the line between protector and perpetrator could blur in the most chilling way. By the time the search wound down without success, Halley returned to his daily patrols. His presence, a reassuring sight for the valley residents, still haunted by Claire's disappearance. Yet, beneath the routine, he carried a knowledge no one else could have the intimate, sometimes frightening understanding of the forest and its secrets. And within those shadows, investigators would eventually uncover clues, patterns, and evidence that would finally reveal the truth. Evidence that pointed, inevitably, to the man behind the uniform. A man whose life was as intertwined with the valley as the trees themselves. Ranger Thomas Halley was, in many ways, a guardian of the Bitterroot. But in Claire Danner's case, he was also the puzzle no one could solve, a figure, both familiar and unknowable, whose knowledge of the wilderness and mastery of procedure created a mystery as complex and chilling as the mountains themselves. The story of Claire's last day in the valley could not be told fully without understanding Halley. The man who watched, the man who guided, and ultimately, the man whose presence would be inseparable from the shadow of her disappearance. In the weeks following Claire Danner's disappearance, the Bitterroot Valley became a labyrinth of theories, dead ends, and unanswered questions. The initial search had ended without results, leaving a community on edge and investigators grasping at fragments of evidence that refused to form a coherent picture. The forest, vast and impenetrable in places, seemed to have swallowed her entirely, and with it, any hope of a straightforward solution. The first challenge was the physical evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Claire's backpack had been recovered near the trailhead, neatly placed on a patch of flattened leaves, her carefully folded map still inside. Oddly, none of her camera equipment had been found. Investigators initially theorized theft, but there were no footprints beyond those she had left, and no signs of struggle. The ground was undisturbed, the foliage intact, as if someone had moved with calculated precision to erase every trace. Even the search dogs struggled to find a scent, their noses trained to detect faint traces of human presence. Sheriff Harold Green documented each anomaly meticulously. In his notebook, he listed what he called the missing elements: the camera, any potential witnesses, the second set of footprints observed near the ridge, and the mysterious red scarf, reported by a hiker weeks later. Every one of these points would later become critical in piecing together Claire's final hours. Investigators came to realize that the case wasn't simply about a lost photographer. It was about a disappearance that had been carefully orchestrated, one designed to evade detection even in the most exhaustive searches. For decades, the trail went cold. Leads dried up, and evidence that might have seemed significant in 1978 was either lost, overlooked, or deemed inconclusive. For instance, Claire's notebook was stored in the sheriff's office, catalogued and preserved. But it wasn't until years later that handwriting analysis and forensic scrutiny would reveal subtle details, notes written with pauses, a smudge of soil suggesting she had crouched in a particular location, and timing inconsistencies hinting at an encounter with another person. At the time, however, those details were filed away, waiting for technology and investigative methodology to catch up. One of the most frustrating aspects for investigators was the terrain itself. Bitterroot Valley, with its dense forests, hidden ravines, and sudden cliffs, presented challenges that went beyond ordinary search procedures. Evidence could vanish with a single misstep, a footprint erased by wind or rain, a note carried away by water, a camera snagged by underbrush. It was as if the wilderness itself conspired to protect the secrets of that fateful day. Search teams documented these difficulties in daily logs, noting areas that were impossible to reach or where conditions had altered dramatically since Claire's disappearance. Interviews conducted over the following months revealed inconsistencies among witness accounts. Local hikers reported seeing someone in a red jacket along the trail, sometimes described as Claire, sometimes described as a stranger. Timber workers mentioned a truck parked near the trailhead early that morning, but no one could provide license plate information or a solid description of the driver. Even Ranger Thomas Hale's accounts, though largely consistent, contained minor contradictions in timing and positioning that investigators would later revisit with intense scrutiny. These small discrepancies, inconsequential on their own, contributed to a cloud of uncertainty that shrouded the case for decades. As the years passed, new technology promised hope, though progress was slow. Photographs were re-examined, maps digitized, and archival records analyzed for patterns missed in the initial investigation. Forensic specialists looked for traces of hair, fibers, and soil, even testing the recovered notebook pages for latent evidence. Yet, despite these efforts, the case remained unresolved. Each potential breakthrough seemed to lead to another dead end, a frustrating cycle that weighed heavily on everyone involved. Family members in the community felt the impact of this stagnation acutely. Claire's parents never gave up, tirelessly revisiting the case, contacting law enforcement, and organizing private searches. They spoke to reporters, hoping to keep her story alive, and urged authorities not to abandon the investigation. The town, meanwhile, existed in a state of suspended anxiety. Parents warned their children to avoid certain trails. Hikers took precautions, and local residents became hyper-aware of the wilderness around them. The mystery of Claire Donna's disappearance was no longer just an investigation. It had become a defining shadow over the valley itself. Despite the stagnation, clues continued to surface sporadically. Decades later, investigators would find subtle but critical elements overlooked in the initial search. A faint footprint in mud near a stream, a camera lens cap in an unusual location, and soil samples that matched areas not previously examined. These pieces, dormant for years, became invaluable when combined with modern forensic techniques. It became clear that the evidence had never been truly lost. It had simply been waiting for the right moment, the right technology, and the right investigators to uncover its meaning. The delays and difficulties in the investigation also highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in remote, rugged environments. Resources were limited, search protocols were imperfect, and the human factor fatigue, stress, and human error played a role in how evidence was collected and interpreted. Every decision, from which trails to prioritize to how long search teams could remain in the field, shaped the trajectory of the investigation. In hindsight, these choices illustrated both the limitations and the dedication of the officers tasked with solving a case that defied easy answers. For decades, the narrative surrounding Claire's disappearance remained dominated by speculation. Theories ranged from wildlife attacks to intentional abduction, from accidental misadventure to foul play by someone she had encountered on the trail. Yet all of these remained just that, theories. Evidence was fragmented, and the mountains held their silence. Even the most determined investigators were forced to accept that for years, the truth lay beyond reach. Yet, in the shadows of these lost decades, a quiet preparation was underway. Each log, photograph, an overlooked note became a foundation for a future breakthrough. Investigators who revisited the case with fresh eyes discovered connections, patterns, and inconsistencies that had been invisible in 1978. It became clear that lost evidence was not truly gone. It was dormant, waiting for the convergence of technology, experience, and persistence. By the end of this chapter, in the investigation, it was evident. The disappearance of Claire Danner was not a simple tragedy. It was a carefully constructed enigma, one that demanded patience, insight, and relentless attention to detail. Every lost clue, every overlooked footprint, and every unanswered question added layers to the story, layers that would ultimately shape the decades-long pursuit of truth. Bitterroot Valley, once frozen in fear, had become the silent witness to a mystery that refused to be ignored. Decades had passed since Claire Danner vanished into the Bitterroot wilderness. In the town below, life continued, but the disappearance never faded. Generations of hikers and local residents remembered the story, the cautionary tales of the red jacket, the ridge, and the camera that had mysteriously vanished. By the late 2000s, the case had long been classified as a cold investigation, a haunting file on a shelf, a puzzle with missing pieces. Yet, as technology advanced, the possibility of resolution quietly emerged, promising to shatter decades of silence. Modern forensic science had evolved dramatically since 1978. Techniques that had been the realm of speculation were now standard practice in law enforcement labs. DNA testing could analyze hair, fibers, and trace skin cells once considered worthless. Digital imaging allowed experts to enhance photographs and recreate scenes with astonishing accuracy. Soil analysis could reveal movement patterns, and even the composition of mud and plant matter became a tool for reconstructing the past. The Danner case, once defined by absence, now had the potential to speak again. The breakthrough began with a careful review of archived evidence. Investigators revisited Claire's journal, her meticulously recorded observations, and the fragments of her belongings recovered at the trailhead. Each item was scanned, analyzed, and catalogued using modern protocols. A forensic team, led by Agent Martha Klein, focused on microscopic details overlooked decades earlier. A fiber caught on the edge of Claire's backpack, a faint smear of soil on the last page of her journal, and a partial footprint preserved in a photograph. These small, almost imperceptible clues held a promise that the larger investigation had long lacked. One pivotal discovery came from Claire's missing camera. Though it had never been recovered, analysis of photographs printed in local newspapers and distributed to family and law enforcement revealed subtle anomalies, shadows, reflections, and background details, long dismissed as inconsequential, were now scrutinized using advanced imaging software. Investigators noticed the faint outline of a figure in the background of one photograph, positioned near a ridge not previously associated with her documented path. This figure's presence, previously invisible, became a critical focal point for the investigation. Further forensic analysis focused on the footprints found along the ridge. At the time, they had been catalogued, but deemed inconclusive. Modern techniques allowed experts to examine soil compaction, weight distribution, and stride patterns with precision. The analysis revealed that the second set of footprints, the ones following Claire's path, belonged to a person with knowledge of the terrain and deliberate intent to remain unnoticed. This finding shifted the case from an unexplained disappearance to a potential abduction, a change that reframed the investigation entirely. Hair and fiber evidence from the trailhead also yielded breakthroughs. DNA testing, impossible in the 1970s, identified traces that did not belong to Claire. These samples suggested a third-party presence, someone who had interacted with her belongings. Combined with the photographic analysis and footprint data, investigators began to reconstruct a timeline that pointed to a human agent rather than an accident or wildlife encounter. For the first time in decades, the cold trail began to warm. Simultaneously, investigators revisited witness statements with fresh eyes. A timber worker who had seen the suspicious truck in 1978 was his recollection once vague and inconsistent, gained new significance in light of the forensic findings. By cross-referencing locations, times, and terrain, law enforcement created a cohesive narrative. The truck's presence, the footprints, and the background figure in the photograph all aligned, forming a pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. The integration of modern GPS mapping also proved invaluable. Investigators reconstructed Claire's likely path with digital precision, overlaying topographical data from 1978 with contemporary imagery. This allowed them to identify areas previously inaccessible or misjudged during the initial search. These locations, once overlooked, became focal points for renewed investigation. Soil and environmental analysis at these sites corroborated the physical evidence found decades earlier. Throughout this process, the dedication of the investigative team was relentless. For Agent Klein and her colleagues, the case was not just a cold file. It was a decades-long commitment to Claire and the community that had waited far too long for answers. Each breakthrough was met with cautious optimism, tempered by the knowledge that decades of silence had created layers of complexity. They were aware that every piece of evidence needed to withstand scrutiny in a potential trial, and that the story they were reconstructing had to be beyond doubt. By the end of this forensic review, it was clear that the disappearance of Claire Danner was no random act. The evidence, once fragmented and overlooked, now formed a cohesive narrative. A prepared hiker, a person following her path, and a series of deliberate actions that suggested planning and intent. The mountains that had hidden her for so long were no longer silent. They had spoken through the minute details left behind. Modern science, patience, and meticulous attention to detail had begun to illuminate what had been obscured for decades. In Bitterroot Valley, the town that had once been frozen in fear began to feel the stirrings of justice. Residents, long resigned to uncertainty, could sense that the decades-long shadow hovering over their community was finally being challenged. And while the full resolution of Claire Danner's fate still lay ahead, the forensic breakthroughs provided the critical foundation upon which the decades-old mystery could finally be solved. The silence that had pervaded the valley for more than 30 years was no longer absolute. In its place emerged a new narrative, one of persistence, science, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. For the first time in decades, hope replaced despair, and the long-lost threads of Claire Danner's story began to weave together, revealing the first glimpses of answers that had been hidden within the Bitterroot wilderness all along. By the early months of 2013, the Claire Danner case had re-entered the national spotlight. For over 35 years, the disappearance had haunted Bitterroot Valley, leaving questions unanswered and communities shaken. But after painstaking forensic analysis, witness re-evaluation, and modern investigative techniques, law enforcement had finally pieced together a timeline and pattern that pointed unambiguously toward one individual, someone who had remained in plain sight for decades, trusted by the very town now grappling with betrayal. Ranger Tomas Ale, once regarded as a pillar of the community, had always been a figure of authority in Bitterroot. His reputation as a meticulous, experienced forest ranger had made him indispensable during the original search in 1978. But investigators had identified inconsistencies in his logs, unexplained access to restricted areas, and subtle details in Claire's last movements that could only have been observed by someone intimately familiar with the terrain. Modern forensic evidence, DNA traces, footprint analysis, and background figures captured in photographs converged on Hale with undeniable precision. The morning of the arrest was eerily quiet. Bitterroot Valley, accustomed to its peaceful rhythm, seemed to hold its breath. Law enforcement officers, both local and federal, positioned themselves strategically around Hale's residence. Unmarked cars lined the street, their engines silent. Deputies moved with disciplined coordination, aware that decades of inaction had created a tense, unpredictable situation. Even as the plan unfolded, officers were careful to maintain composure. They knew that the arrest of a respected figure in a small town carried emotional and social consequences. At precisely 7:32 a.m., Hale was confronted at his front door. "Thomas Hale, Montana Department of Justice. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1978 disappearance of Claire Danner." The lead officer announced. Hale's expression was unreadable, his gaze calm, almost clinical. Years of routine, observation, and familiarity with the valley had not prepared him for this moment, yet he betrayed no outward panic. Inside, however, Decades of careful concealment were about to unravel. The arrest sent shockwaves through Bitterroot Valley. Residents, many of whom had known Halle for years, struggled to reconcile the image of the dependable ranger with the allegations now laid bare. Local businesses buzzed with whispered conversations. Families debated what they had known, what they had observed, and what could have been overlooked. The arrest was more than a procedural act. It was a rupture in the fabric of the community, a public acknowledgement that a trusted figure had been involved in a crime that had remained unsolved for generations. Investigators were methodical in their approach. Halle was transported to a secure facility, where interrogations began under controlled conditions. Forensic evidence, painstakingly compiled over decades, was presented alongside witness accounts and detailed reconstructions of the 1978 disappearance. Agents highlighted key points: the second set of footprints along the ridge, the background figure in the photograph, soil and fiber traces that matched Hale's known presence, and subtle discrepancies in his historical logs. Each piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued, leaving little room for doubt. During the questioning, Halle maintained a composed exterior, often responding in measured tones, careful not to reveal more than necessary. Yet, beneath the calm, investigators sensed the weight of exposure. Every strategic misstep, every overlooked detail from decades prior, was now magnified under modern forensic scrutiny. Hale's knowledge of the forest, once his advantage, became a liability. It had enabled concealment, but it also left traces that modern methods could now detect. The arrest also had profound psychological implications for the investigators. Many had worked on cold cases for years, often with limited resources and little hope of resolution. Seeing a decades-old mystery finally converge on a tangible suspect provided a sense of vindication and closure for the law enforcement. Teams who had invested immense effort in preserving the integrity of the investigation, the meticulous work of piecing together fragmented evidence, revisiting old witness statements, and applying modern forensic science had finally borne fruit. For the Danner family, the arrest was a complicated moment. Relief mingled with shock. Hope that had long been deferred now returned in cautious increments, tempered by the emotional weight of betrayal and loss. Claire's parents, who had spent decades advocating for renewed investigation, finally had the answer they had sought for so long. Yet, the closure was bittersweet, for the decades of uncertainty and grief could never be fully erased. The local community grappled with the consequences. Halle had been a familiar presence, a figure who had guided generations through the forests and valleys of Bitterroot. His arrest forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, authority, and the fallibility of perception. What had once been a safe, predictable landscape now seemed layered with hidden histories, reminders that appearances could be deceiving, and that even those closest to the truth could manipulate it. By the end of the day, the arrest had set the stage for what would follow. Prosecution, trial, and the public unveiling of a decades-old conspiracy hidden within the forests of Montana. For the investigators, it was a triumph of diligence, technology, and patience. For the community, it was a reckoning. And for Claire Danner, whose life had been swallowed by the wilderness, it marked the first step toward justice, long overdue, but finally within reach. As the sun set over Bitterroot Valley, shadows lengthened across the mountains. The forests remained as silent as ever, indifferent to human affairs. Yet their secrets were no longer entirely hidden. The arrest of Thomas Halle proved that even the most meticulously concealed truths could be exposed. And while the valley would never forget the fear and uncertainty that had gripped it for decades, it now held a new narrative, one of resolution, persistence, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The courtroom in Helena, Montana, was packed to capacity the morning the trial began. Bitterroot Valley had waited decades for this day, a day that promised answers to questions long whispered in kitchens, at trailheads, and among friends who had grown up hearing the story of Claire Danner's disappearance. Cameras, reporters, and citizens filled every seat, all eager to witness the unraveling of a mystery that had shaped the community for generations. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, tension, and an almost tangible sense of history finally in motion. From the outset, the prosecution emphasized the meticulous nature of the investigation. Evidence compiled over 35 years was presented with precision. Photographs of Claire's last known location, forensic soil and fiber analysis, reconstructed footprints along the ridge, and newly uncovered witness accounts that corroborated her final movements. Each exhibit was more than documentation. It was a story of diligence, modern science, and the dogged persistence of law enforcement, unwilling to let decades of uncertainty remain unresolved. Ranger Thomas Hawley sat at the defensetable.com and composed, a man whose life of public trust was now on display for scrutiny. His uniform of authority had been replaced by the sterile fabric of a courtroom, yet the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined his work in the field now became his armor. The defense argued familiarity with the terrain did not equate to culpability, emphasizing Hale's decades of service to the valley and suggesting that evidence had been misinterpreted through hindsight bias. They framed him as a dedicated public servant whose life had been scrutinized unfairly. The trial moved deliberately, each day bringing new testimony and new revelations. Forensic experts explained, in precise yet understandable terms, how modern analysis had identified a second set of footprints that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Photographs once thought to be innocuous were dissected, showing subtle evidence of a presence in the clearing where Claire had paused on her last recorded day. DNA samples and fiber analysis, impossible in 1978, were demonstrated to the jury in clear visual sequences, highlighting the meticulous chain of evidence that had brought investigators closer to the truth. Witnesses from the original search were called back to the stand. Timber workers, hikers, and local residents recounted their memories, some faint, some vivid. Each testimony added texture to the timeline, bridging the decades between Claire's disappearance and the arrest. Their recollections, previously fragmented, now intersected with forensic data, forming a narrative that made the once invisible movements of the forest intelligible. One hiker described the fleeting sight of a dark vehicle near the trailhead, its tires pressed in the mud, a detail that, decades earlier, had seemed minor, but now served as a crucial piece of the puzzle. The courtroom tension was heightened by the community's emotional involvement. Family members, friends, and residents listened intently as the story of Claire's last day was reconstructed. Her journal, once a personal record of adventure, was read aloud in excerpts, giving the jury and public a glimpse into her meticulous planning, her keen observation of the natural world, and her calm determination. The words, written decades prior, carried the weight of presence, observation, and sudden absence, a haunting juxtaposition that underscored the gravity of the case. Cross-examination revealed further complexities. Hale's defense attorneys questioned the interpretation of footprints, suggesting environmental conditions could have altered the evidence over time. They scrutinized witness memory, highlighting the passage of decades and potential lapses in recollection. But the prosecution countered, presenting corroborating forensic evidence, GPS mapping, and analytical reconstructions that illustrated consistency across multiple independent sources. Slowly, the weight of empirical evidence began to dominate over speculation, guiding the jury toward a clearer understanding of the events that had transpired on that ridge decades ago. In a dramatic moment, the jury viewed a digital reconstruction of Claire's last known movements, integrating all available data, her recorded journal entries, photographs, and environmental reconstructions of the trail. The animation recreated the ridge, the clearing, the narrowing path, and the surrounding terrain. It highlighted where footprints had appeared, where she had paused, and where the unknown presence had been observed. The courtroom was silent. The viewers were immersed in the reconstruction, experiencing the tension, the solitude, and the subtle dangers of the landscape that had concealed the truth for so long. Throughout the trial, the emotional resonance of the story remained palpable. Witnesses reflected on the community's long-standing fear, the burden of uncertainty, and the decades of unrelenting hope. Each day of testimony emphasized that this case was not merely about legal culpability. It was about restoring narrative order to lives disrupted, communities unsettled, and a wilderness that had silently observed everything without revealing its secrets. By the final days, the courtroom had absorbed the full weight of decades-long investigation. Evidence meticulously presented, witness accounts validated through cross-reference, and modern forensic science converged to illustrate a compelling narrative. Claire Dehner's disappearance had been neither random nor accidental. The forest, while vast and isolating, had been traversed by an individual with intent, knowledge, and opportunity. The silence that had defined Bitterroot Valley for over 3 decades was finally being broken in concrete. undeniable terms. As closing arguments were delivered, the jury faced the cumulative gravity of the decades-old mystery. They were not only deciding a matter of law, but were also entrusted with resolving a story that had lingered in the collective consciousness of a community. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, and each reconstructed movement had been carefully presented, ensuring that the decision would reflect not only facts, but the painstaking pursuit of truth. By the end of Chapter 8, the valley itself seemed to hold its breath. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was the culmination of decades of human observation, scientific advancement, and unwavering dedication. The people of Bitterroot Valley, the family of Claire Danner, and those who had labored tirelessly to uncover the truth, were finally on the cusp of resolution. And while the final verdict still awaited the jury's decision, the narrative had been restored, and the mountains that had concealed secrets for generations had begun to speak, revealing a story of persistence, justice, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The courtroom in Helena was tense, every seat filled with people who had waited decades for this moment. Bitterroot Valley, a community that had carried the weight of Claire Danner's disappearance for over 35 years, now held its collective breath. Families, hikers, local officials, and journalists gathered, anticipating the verdict that would finally close a chapter that had lingered like a shadow over the mountains, the forests, and every trail Claire had once walked. The jury deliberated. 4 hours, immersed in evidence, painstakingly collected over decades. Forensic breakthroughs, photographs, soil and fiber analysis, reconstructed footprints, witness testimonies, and digital trail simulations were all weighed. Each detail, small or large, had been cross-examined, scrutinized, and interpreted with precision. The prosecution had framed a meticulous narrative. A young woman, prepared and cautious, confronted by someone whose intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed a disappearance to remain hidden for decades. The defense had emphasized character, service, and the passage of time, arguing for alternative explanations. Outside the courtroom, the town was silent yet electric with anticipation. Families who had grown up hearing the story now stood on the cusp of closure. Community members, who had once shared whispered theories and warnings along the ridge trails, now felt the tension of real consequences. Bitterroot Valley had become a living narrative, the mountains themselves a backdrop to a drama decades in the making. Even those who had long since moved away had returned, drawn by the promise of resolution and the symbolic weight of justice at last. Inside, Claire's parents sat side by side, their faces lined with decades of hope, anxiety, and grief. They had spent years advocating, searching, and demanding attention to a case that had become a defining feature of their lives. Now, as the jurors filed in, the emotions were raw, a mixture of anticipation, fear, and the first hints of relief. This moment was not just legal, it was deeply personal, representing decades of unanswered questions and the long-delayed promise of accountability. The foreperson read the verdict slowly, deliberately, each word echoing in the hushed chamber. Guilty, guilty. The word resonated, not just as a legal determination, but as the culmination of 35 years of investigation, analysis, and unwavering dedication. Ranger Tomasali, once the trusted guardian of the Bitterroot Valley, was now formally held accountable for his role in Claire's disappearance. The reaction in the courtroom was a complex mix of relief, shock, and quiet sorrow. Families exhaled, some wept, and the community absorbed the weight of truth, long deferred. For the investigative teams, the verdict was a triumph of diligence over time. Law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, some from the original search, others from decades later using modern techniques, felt a profound sense of vindication. Their persistence, meticulous documentation, and integration of new forensic methods had turned fragmented evidence into a compelling narrative that withstood scrutiny. Decades of patience, combined with advances in science and unwavering commitment, had produced a resolution that seemed almost impossible when Claire first vanished. The aftermath extended beyond legal accountability. Bitterroot Valley, while relieved, faced the challenge of reconciling the betrayal of trust. Hale's position in the community, his decades of authority and influence, contrasted sharply with the reality of his actions. Families and residents grappled with the duality of the man they had trusted and the crimes he had concealed. Local, schools, hiking groups, and community organizations began conversations about awareness, safety, and the importance of vigilance, even in familiar circles. For Claire's family, the verdict allowed them to honor her memory and begin the long process of healing. Public statements, memorials, and community gatherings followed, emphasizing resilience, remembrance, and the enduring importance of pursuit for justice. While the decades of uncertainty could never be undone, the legal resolution provided clarity and validation for a story that had lingered in shadows for far too long. The case also inspired broader reflection on cold cases nationwide. Law enforcement agencies recognized the value of combining historical evidence with modern technology, while communities acknowledged the human impact of unresolved disappearances. The Danner case became a model for collaboration, patience, and innovation in criminal investigations, illustrating that even decades-old mysteries could be solved with dedication and foresight. As the courtroom emptied and the sun dipped behind the Bitterroot peaks, the valley felt different. Silence remained in the forests, but now it was quieter, weighted with resolution rather than uncertainty. Trails once avoided became spaces of memory and reflection, not fear. And Claire Denner, though long gone, had left a mark, a reminder that persistence, science, and truth could prevail even against the most stubborn shadows. Justice had arrived, not swiftly, but finally. Bitterroot Valley, scarred yet resilient, could begin to move forward, carrying the lessons of the past, the stories of courage, and the unwavering message that no secret, no matter how deeply hidden, could remain buried forever. The mountains had spoken, and the valley listened, forever changed by the pursuit of truth and the long-awaited closure of a story decades in the making. The Bitterroot Valley had changed forever. Decades of fear, uncertainty, and unanswered questions had finally given way to resolution. But the echoes of Claire Dana's disappearance lingered in the air, in the forests, and in the hearts of the community. The arrest, trial, and verdict had provided justice. Yet the legacy of the case extended far beyond legal closure. It had reshaped the way the town approached trust, safety, and the preservation of memory. For Claire's family, the years of grief and uncertainty were tempered by a newfound sense of closure. Public memorials honored her life and resilience, celebrating not just her tragic disappearance, but also her meticulous spirit, her curiosity, and the courage she displayed in exploring the wilderness she loved. Photographs, journal entries, and personal effects became part of a permanent display in a small community museum, ensuring that her story would educate and inspire future generations. These artifacts, once part of a cold case file, now carried profound meaning, lessons in attention to detail, perseverance, and the enduring power of human curiosity. Law enforcement agencies used the Danner case as a blueprint for solving long-standing cold cases. Investigators emphasized the importance of revisiting old evidence with fresh eyes, combining historical documentation with modern forensic methods. Digital reconstruction, DNA testing, and cross-referencing witness accounts demonstrated that even decades-old mysteries could yield answers. Bitterroot Valley became a case study for detective work nationwide, showing that patience, persistence, and innovation could overcome the limitations of time and terrain. The town itself embraced a culture of vigilance without fear. Community safety initiatives were launched, including updated trail monitoring, communication protocols for hikers, and public awareness campaigns about wilderness preparedness. Schools integrated Claire's story into lessons on critical thinking, problem solving, and ethical responsibility. Local authorities worked with residents to ensure that while the mountains remained a place of beauty and adventure, they were also respected as spaces where awareness and caution were essential. Psychologically, the Danner case transformed the community's relationship with its environment. Trails that had once been avoided due to fear now became pathways for remembrance, reflection, and education. The forests were no longer merely landscapes of uncertainty. They became living classrooms, teaching lessons about observation, detail, and the fragility of human life. Residents spoke openly about the emotional impact of the disappearance, the decades of anxiety it caused, and the relief that came with final resolution. These conversations fostered collective healing and reinforced the community's resilience. For the investigative team, the case reinforced the importance of collaboration across decades. Original officers, retired detectives, modern forensic analysts, and legal professionals worked in unison, demonstrating that even fragmented and aging evidence could be transformed into compelling narratives and actionable insights. The Danner case became a testament to the notion that the pursuit of truth is not bound by time. Dedication, methodical documentation, and an unwavering commitment to justice can bridge generations. Media coverage of the case extended beyond Montana. True crime documentaries, articles, and interviews explored the story, highlighting the investigative breakthroughs and the emotional impact on the community. The Danner case became symbolic of how cold cases, when approached with rigor and compassion, could capture public imagination, educate audiences, and inspire ongoing efforts to resolve long-standing mysteries. It showcased the balance between scientific precision and human empathy necessary for meaningful criminal investigations. Most importantly, the legacy of Claire Denard herself endured. She became a symbol of resilience and the power of the human spirit in the face of uncertainty. Her meticulous journaling, attention to detail, and dedication to her craft contributed indirectly to the eventual resolution of her own disappearance. She reminded everyone that evidence, no matter how subtle or overlooked, carries meaning. And that truth has a way of emerging, even when buried for decades. Bitterroot Valley, once haunted by the unknown, now bore the imprint of clarity, justice, and collective reflection. The mountains remained indifferent, yet witness to human determination, their forests whispering lessons of caution, vigilance, and the enduring search for answers. Every trail, every ridge, every clearing became a reminder of what had been lost, what had been uncovered, and what could be learned. As the community moved forward, they carried with them the enduring lessons of the case. That persistence matters, that science and human observation can converge to uncover truth, and that no matter how long justice takes, it remains possible. Claire Denard's story became part of the collective memory, a narrative of courage, tragedy, and eventual resolution that would echo in Bitterroot Valley forever. In the end, the Danner case was more than a criminal investigation. It was a story of a community's resilience, of science's triumph over time, and of the unyielding pursuit of truth in the face of decades of silence. Bitterroot Valley, shaped by fear and mystery, had finally emerged wiser, more violent, and profoundly changed, a place where the echoes of the past would guide the paths of the future, and where Claire's memory would never fade. Even after the trial concluded and justice had been formally delivered, Bitterroot Valley was not the same. The mountains remained silent and vast, holding memories of what had occurred decades before. Yet, within the town, an awareness lingered, a heightened understanding of the fragile line between trust and deception, and the enduring consequences of actions hidden in plain sight. Claire Denard's story had left a permanent imprint, not only on the law enforcement personnel who had worked tirelessly, but also on every family, hiker, and resident who had followed the case. The months following the verdict became a time of reflection. Local historians began documenting the full chronology of events, collecting testimonies from retired officers, journalists, and community members who had witnessed the evolution of the investigation. Each account added layers to the narrative, revealing how human memory, perseverance, and attention to detail had intersected to solve a case that had seemed insurmountable. Residents were reminded that even the smallest observations, a footprint, a fleeting shadow, a misplaced object, could one day provide critical insights. Claire's family continued to honor her memory through outreach initiatives and educational programs. Hiking safety workshops, wilderness preparedness courses, and youth programs were established in her name, encouraging a generation to explore responsibly while remaining vigilant. These initiatives became a living legacy, blending remembrance with practical lessons, ensuring that Claire's story was not only remembered but actively shaped the values and safety of the community she loved. Psychologically, the town began to process the long shadows cast by the disappearance. Families revisited old trails, not out of fear, but with newfound perspective. Conversations around dinner tables and at school gatherings reflected lessons learned, the importance of observation, the persistence of truth, and the need to challenge assumptions, even when circumstances seem ordinary. The Danner case had created a collective consciousness around the subtle ways danger could manifest in familiar spaces. Law enforcement officers, both current and retired, continued to analyze the case as a model for best practices. The integration of modern forensic techniques with historical documentation became a cornerstone example in training programs across Montana and beyond. Investigators emphasized patience, methodical review, and the combination of human intuition with scientific rigor. Claire's disappearance had transcended its initial tragedy to become a blueprint for solving cold cases and preventing future ones. Community memorials also played a role in collective healing. Plaques, commemorative benches, and guided trail markers allowed visitors to experience the valley while remembering the story that had shaped it. These public installations encouraged reflection, a pause in the rhythm of daily life, reminding residents and visitors alike that behind every trail, every ridge, and every shadowed clearing, there is a story, and often a lesson waiting to be learned. Media interest continued, but shifted from speculation to education. Documentaries and interviews explored not only the crime itself, but also the methodology, science, and persistence that led to resolution. These narratives highlighted the human element, the dedication of investigators, the courage of Claire's family, and the resilience of the community. Viewers worldwide gained insight into the intricate process of solving long-unsolved mysteries and the personal sacrifices required to pursue justice. By the end of Chapter 11, it was clear that Bitterroot Valley had entered a new chapter. Fear and uncertainty had been replaced by understanding, vigilance, and a sense of empowerment. The lessons of the case resonated beyond Claire's disappearance, shaping how the town approached community safety, education, and memory. While shadows of the past remained, they were now interwoven with light. The knowledge that persistence, attention to detail, and the courage to seek truth could triumph over even the deepest mysteries. Claire Danares' story, once defined by absence, had transformed into a legacy of learning, resilience, and vigilance. Bitterroot Valley, forever altered by her disappearance, now carried the enduring echo of her life, her courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. And though the forests remained silent witnesses, the town itself had learned to speak, reflect, and remember, ensuring that the lessons of the past would continue to guide generations into the future. As the seasons changed over Bitterroot Valley, the story of Claire Daner settled into the collective memory of the community. The mountains remained unchanged, silent guardians of decades of secrets, yet the valley itself had transformed. From fear and uncertainty had emerged knowledge, resilience, and a renewed commitment to vigilance. The final chapter of this long saga was not simply about justice, it was about understanding, reflection, and the enduring lessons left by a life tragically cut short. Investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case reflected on the journey from disappearance to resolution. For them, the Danner case was more than a high-profile investigation. It had been a masterclass in patience, collaboration, and innovation. They noted how critical each small detail had been. The soil samples, the partial footprints, the fibers, the photographs that once seemed inconsequential. It was a testament to the principle that no clue is ever truly insignificant, and that the persistence of human observation, coupled with evolving technology, can ultimately illuminate even the darkest mysteries. In the town, the emotional echoes were equally profound. Families who had lived under the shadow of Claire's disappearance experienced a sense of closure that had been decades in coming. Trails that were once avoided due to lingering fear now became spaces of reflection and remembrance. Community members organized guided hikes, combining education with commemoration, ensuring that Claire's story and the lessons of her disappearance would be shared with every generation. Safety workshops and wilderness preparedness programs flourished, turning tragedy into practical, life-saving knowledge. The Danner family, though forever shaped by grief, embraced this final phase with grace and purpose. They participated in memorial initiatives, educational programs, and public speaking engagements, sharing Claire's story to inspire awareness and resilience. Their courage in the face of decades-long uncertainty became a symbol of hope, proof that dedication, patience, and belief in justice could endure, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. From a broader perspective, the case became a model for investigative practice nationwide. Law enforcement agencies studied the integration of historical evidence with modern forensic methods, the meticulous reconstruction of events, the patient piecing together of fragmented clues, and the strategic use of technological advancements demonstrated how cold cases could be solved, even decades later. Claire Dana's story became a beacon for investigators, emphasizing that no case is truly beyond resolution, and no victim is ever truly forgotten. Yet, the most lasting lesson lay in the community itself. Bitterroot Valley learned that trust, while essential, must be tempered with awareness, and that ordinary spaces can conceal extraordinary mysteries. The mountains, once viewed with suspicion and fear, became living classrooms for observation, critical thinking, and reflection. Residents understood that vigilance is not paranoia. It is the practical continuation of care for one another and for the landscapes that surround them. As the sun set over the Bitterroot peaks, casting long shadows across the forests and trails, there was a profound sense of equilibrium. The valley, once defined by absence and uncertainty, now resonated with understanding, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction that truth, no matter how delayed, had emerged. The mountains remained silent, but the human stories that had unfolded within their depths had spoken volumes. In the final reflection, Claire Danner's life, disappearance, and the eventual resolution of her case were not simply historical events. They were living lessons. Lessons in diligence, the intersection of human perception and science, and the power of persistence. Bitterroot Valley would carry these lessons forward, honoring both the tragedy and the triumph of justice. The story, though concluded, would continue to inspire awareness, vigilance, and the belief that even the longest shadows can be illuminated. Justice had arrived. Closure had been achieved, and the echoes of Claire Danner's story would continue to guide, teach, and resonate, a final testament to the enduring pursuit of truth in a world that often hides it.